Families can look polished from the outside, but behind closed doors, pride and cruelty often live at the same table. A brother once branded worthless sat quietly while his siblings mocked him, never realizing the day would come when their laughter would turn to silence. What seems like a simple rivalry will unravel into one of the most dramatic reversals you'll ever hear. Like this story, if it grips you already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me in the comments what part you think will flip the balance and where you're watching from. Ethan Williams sat at the far end of the dinner table, a place that had begun to feel less like a seat of family togetherness and more like a witness stand where every word, every glance, every silence became evidence against him. The scent of fried chicken, collard greens, and cornbread filled the air, but the warmth of the food could not mask the coldness of the laughter directed at him. Ethan was a young black man raised in a family that had always preached resilience, pride, and hard work. Yet tonight he was the target of ridicule from the very siblings who should have stood beside him. Carla leaned back in her chair, her pearl earrings catching the light as she arched an eyebrow. "So Ethan," she began, her tone dripping with false sweetness, "how's the job hunt going? Or should I say, how's life as Mama's favorite couch decoration?" Her voice sliced through the chatter like a knife, drawing laughter from cousins and uncles who didn't dare stand against her sharp tongue. Ethan stared at his plate, pushing peas into a corner as though arranging them could shield him from her words. Before he could gather a reply, Darnell chimed in, his deep voice booming with mock amusement. "Don't waste your breath asking him that, Carla. My man's been out of work so long he probably forgot what an alarm clock even sounds like. He's perfected unemployment into an art form." More laughter erupted, loud and unkind, bouncing off the walls of their mother's modest home. Ethan's heart sank lower with each chuckle, but he kept his eyes fixed on his plate. His chest burned with the familiar ache of humiliation, yet he knew that answering back would only feed their cruelty. The truth was, he had been searching relentlessly, desperately since losing his job in a round of layoffs nearly 2 years earlier. He had filled out applications, sat through interviews, endured rejection after rejection, but none of that mattered to his siblings. They didn't see his effort, they only saw his failure. "I'm just taking my time," Ethan mumbled, but the words carried no weight, drowned out by Carla's rolling laughter. She clutched her stomach, feigning disbelief. "Taking your time? Honey, you've been taking your time so long you could have earned a doctorate in doing nothing." The room roared again, and even their mother, weary from a double shift at the hospital, said nothing. She only sighed, reached for her sweet tea, and let the silence stand as an invisible judgment. Ethan swallowed hard. He could endure his siblings' venom, but his mother's quiet disappointment pierced deeper than any insult. Still, he forced himself to smile faintly, as if their mockery didn't matter, though inside he was crumbling. What no one at that table knew was that Ethan had already begun a journey they couldn't imagine. For weeks, he had been working quietly at a small black-owned startup on the south side, a modest operation tucked between a barbershop and a grocery store. It wasn't glamorous. He swept floors, sorted files, made deliveries, but he was learning. The founder, an older friend of his late father, had taken him under his wing. One evening, after everyone else had gone home, the man looked Ethan square in the eye and said, "Son, you've got ideas. Don't let their voices drown you out. Keep showing up. That's how you build something real." Those words became Ethan's anchor. He repeated them silently now as his siblings smirked, as his cousins giggled, as the weight of being the jobless one pressed against his chest. They thought he was stagnant, but he was moving, slowly but steadily, laying bricks no one else could see. He kept his secret guarded because he knew what Carla and Darnell would say if they found out. They would sneer at the tiny office, mock the startup as a pipe dream, dismiss his work as beneath them. They were too enamored with the prestige of corporate titles and polished business cards to recognize the quiet power of beginnings. Better, he decided, to let them laugh now and let the truth speak later. Dinner carried on with Carla boasting about her recent promotion at the firm downtown. She sprinkled her sentences with words like executive track and leadership pipeline, savoring the way relatives nodded in admiration. Darnell, not to be outdone, bragged about managing a lucrative account, his chest swelling with pride as he described late nights at the office. They painted themselves as rising stars, climbing ladders Ethan wasn't even allowed to touch. Then Darnell looked across the table, feigning sympathy that only sharpened the cruelty of his words. "One day, maybe Ethan will surprise us all and get a real job." Until then, I guess Mama's couch still has his name carved into it. The laughter that followed was crueler than before, edged with malice. Ethan gripped his fork so tightly his knuckles turned pale, but he didn't rise to the bait. He didn't give them the satisfaction of an outburst. Instead, he let the humiliation burn into determination. His siblings didn't realize that every insult was fuel, every smirk was kindling for the fire he carried inside. They had no idea that his silence was not surrender, it was preparation. When the plates were cleared and his mother began stacking dishes in the sink, Ethan rose quietly, kissed her cheek, and stepped into the cool evening air. The laughter still echoed in his ears, but beneath it, he heard the softer echo of his mentor's words, "Keep showing up." The Sunday after the disastrous dinner, Ethan found himself once again in the company of his siblings. This time at his mother's living room, where the family had gathered for the monthly check-in, she insisted on holding to keep everyone close. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and candles, the air buzzing with conversation, yet Ethan sat quietly in the corner of the worn brown sofa, his body still remembering the sting of the laughter from just a week earlier. Carla strutted into the room in a fitted navy suit that looked like it had been pulled from a glossy magazine spread. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor like punctuation marks, each step demanding attention. Darnell followed, crisp shirt pressed so sharp it could cut, gold watch flashing every time he adjusted his cuff. They made an entrance designed to be noticed, and everyone noticed, especially Ethan. He kept his gaze lowered, fiddling with the hem of his shirt, but the show was impossible to ignore. "Well, Mama," Carla said, planting herself on the love seat like a queen claiming her throne, "I thought you'd want to know your daughter just secured a place in the executive track program. Only 12 chosen out of the whole division, and I was one of them." She let the words hang in the air like confetti, waiting for the applause. Darnell smirked, adding with a dramatic stretch of his arms, "And let's not forget yours truly. Just got the lead on the Anderson account. That's millions in revenue under my management. They said I'm on the fast path to director level." Their mother clapped politely, her face lighting up with pride that Ethan hadn't seen directed his way in years. "That's wonderful, babies," she said, her voice brimming with warmth. "I'm proud of you both." The pride settled in the room like a crown placed on their heads, while Ethan sat in the corner wearing the invisible mark of failure. Carla's eyes cut toward him, sharp and deliberate. "Don't worry, Ethan," she said sweetly. "Maybe one day you'll find yourself inside a building like ours. If they ever start hiring couch philosophers." The room chuckled softly, relatives shifting uncomfortably but unwilling to challenge her. Darnell leaned forward, his grin wide. "Nah, Carla, let's be real. They'd never even let him pass security. Man doesn't know the first thing about corporate life." He'd get lost in the lobby. The jab landed like a punch, and Ethan felt heat rise in his cheeks. He wanted to tell them that corporate life wasn't the golden ticket they thought it was, that climbing ladders built by someone else wasn't the only way to build a future, but the words stuck in his throat. He didn't want to reveal his cards too soon, not while they were so quick to twist everything he said into another joke at his expense. He shifted in his seat, reaching for a glass of water when a folder slipped out of Darnell's briefcase. The logo printed on the corner caught Ethan's eye sharp, bold, familiar. He froze, his pulse quickening. It was the same logo he had seen stapled on a memo in the office of the small startup where he had been quietly working. At first, he thought it was coincidence, but the name was unmistakable. The firm where Carla and Darnell now strutted with pride had just absorbed the startup where Ethan was cutting his teeth. His siblings didn't know it, but their boastful kingdom was directly tied to the humble place he had been sweeping floors and learning ledgers. A flicker of realization sparked in his chest. So small he kept his face still, his breath steady, but inside he felt a tremor of possibility. Carla mistook his silence for shame and pressed harder. "See, Ethan," she said, smoothing her skirt, "you've got to be strategic. You can't just sit around waiting for life to hand you something. You've got to grab the opportunities. That's why we're moving up while you're still stuck," Darnell chuckled. "Truth hurts, bro. You've got nothing to offer a place like this. It's a different world. And you don't belong in it." Their mother looked down at her hand, saying nothing, which hurt Ethan more than the insults themselves. He wanted her to defend him, to remind them that everyone's journey looked different, but her silence told him she too was swayed by their shiny titles and polished shoes. Ethan forced a small smile, careful not to let the glimmer of knowledge in his chest show on his face. They thought he didn't belong, but the truth was he was already inside the system they bragged about. Not at their level, not yet, but inside nonetheless. The startup may have been small, but now it carried the weight of the very firm they worshipped. He thought of the nights he stayed late with Mr. Parker, his mentor, learning how numbers spoke louder than charm, how patience outlasted arrogance. Carla and Darnell didn't see it yet, but their future and his were more intertwined than they realized. The gathering continued, Carla and Darnell spinning tales of their achievements, showering themselves in the glow of attention. Ethan listened, nodding occasionally, while inside he carried the seed of a secret. He knew it was too early to reveal, too early to stand tall. For now, he would let them sharpen their knives on his silence, let them mock what they couldn't understand. But one day soon, the knives would dull, and his silence would shatter into a truth too large to ignore. When the evening ended and relatives began filtering out, Ethan hugged his mother and stepped into the night air once more. The cool breeze brushed against his skin, reminding him that change was coming, whether his siblings saw it or not. He glanced back through the window, watching Carla laugh and Darnell gesture proudly, their reflections caught in the glass like actors on a stage. They thought they had written him out of the script, but Ethan knew better. The next act was already in motion, and this time he would not be the punchline. Ethan did not want to go to his cousin's birthday party, but refusing would only draw more suspicion and more accusations that he was hiding from the family. His mother insisted that everyone should come together for occasions like these, so he agreed, though his stomach churned with the familiar anxiety of what his siblings might say in front of a larger audience. The party was held at a rented hall on the west side of town, music thumping from speakers in the corner, kids running around with balloons, and the smell of barbecue smoke drifting in through the open doors. Ethan walked in quietly, wearing a simple button-down shirt and clean jeans, doing his best to look presentable despite the self-consciousness that clung to him like a shadow. Carla and Darnell were already there, dressed like they had stepped out of a corporate brochure, shaking hands and laughing loudly as if they owned the room. Carla spotted Ethan immediately and smirked, whispering something to Darnell that made him chuckle before they made their way toward him. "Look who finally crawled out of Mama's house," Carla said with a wide smile that hid the sharpness beneath her words. "We were worried you might not show up since, you're probably busy doing nothing." Her voice carried just enough for nearby relatives to hear, and several turned their heads with awkward glances. Ethan forced a polite smile, determined not to rise to the bait. Darnell clapped him on the back a little too hard and added, "Don't mind her, man, she's just joking." But seriously, folks, our brother here is still jobless, still trying to figure out what he wants to be when he grows up. Give him a round of applause for consistency. Laughter rippled through the crowd, some genuine, some nervous, but it all felt like knives against Ethan's skin. His jaw tightened, but he kept silent, swallowing the bitterness that rose in his throat. His mother, busy greeting other guests, either did not hear or chose to ignore the cruelty. Carla, emboldened by the laughter, raised her glass and said, "You know what? Maybe next year we'll all chip in and get Ethan a career starter kit, an alarm clock, a necktie, and a manual on how to actually keep a job." The room erupted again, and Ethan felt heat rush to his face. But before he could slip away, a voice behind him cut through the noise. "Ethan Williams?" Ethan turned and saw a man about his age, tall and confident, with a smile of recognition. It took a moment before Ethan realized it was Jordan Mitchell, a classmate from college he hadn't seen in years. Jordan reached out to shake his hand firmly, his voice warm. "Man, I can't believe it's you. I heard you've been working on that exciting project over at Parker's firm. That's incredible. I always knew you had the brain for numbers." The entire room seemed to freeze. Carla's smile faltered, her glass lowering slightly. Darnell's laugh died in his throat as eyes turned from Jordan back to Ethan, confusion rippling through the crowd. Ethan, caught off guard, returned the handshake and nodded, his voice steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. "Yeah, I've been keeping busy with that," he said simply, refusing to elaborate but letting the words hang in the air. Jordan beamed. "Good for you, man. That firm's got potential. Parker's a sharp guy, and anyone working under him is bound to do big things. I'm proud of you." He gave Ethan a friendly pat on the shoulder before being pulled away by another group of guests, leaving silence in his wake. Carla's face stiffened, her polished confidence cracking. "What was that about?" she asked, her tone tight. "Since when are you working on projects at some firm?" Darnell frowned, his arms crossed. "Yeah, what's he talking about, Ethan?" "Don't tell me you've been hiding something." Ethan held their stares calmly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I've been keeping myself busy," he said, deliberately vague. He let the words sit there, offering nothing more, and then walked toward the food table as if their questions didn't matter. Behind him, he heard the low murmur of confusion spreading, relatives whispering, trying to reconcile the image of the jobless brother with the unexpected revelation that he was connected to something bigger. Carla quickly forced a laugh, trying to recover. "Don't take that too seriously," she said to the nearest group of aunts. "Probably just some volunteer work or a side hustle. Ethan's not exactly corporate material," but the doubt had already been planted. The relatives who had laughed at the jokes now looked at Ethan with curiosity instead of scorn, and Carla and Darnell's control of the narrative had slipped, if only slightly. The rest of the evening passed with an uneasy tension. Carla and Darnell tried to redirect attention back to themselves, boasting about their promotions and their bright futures, but the whispers continued. Ethan stayed quiet, mingling here and there, never over-explaining, letting Jordan's words carry their own weight. By the time the cake was served and the party began to wind down, Carla and Darnell's expressions were tight, their smiles brittle. Ethan left before the night ended, stepping into the cool night air with a sense of quiet satisfaction. For once, he had not been the punchline. For once, their mockery had been disrupted by a truth they weren't prepared for. He didn't need to explain everything to them yet. The time would come when they would see it all for themselves. But tonight, in the middle of humiliation, a small victory had bloomed. As he drove home, Ethan replayed the moment in his mind, Jordan's voice, the surprise on his siblings' faces, the shift in the room's energy. It was proof that their power over him was not absolute, that their words could be broken by reality. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his resolve deepening. Let them mock, let them laugh. The truth was building behind the scenes, and soon it would be undeniable. The week after the birthday party, the shift in family dynamics lingered like smoke after a fire. Ethan could feel it in the way Carla and Darnell's eyes lingered longer than usual, suspicious and searching, as though they were trying to uncover what Jordan Mitchell had meant by exciting project. They had controlled the narrative of Ethan's life for so long, painting him as the perpetual failure, that the idea of him having a role in something legitimate gnawed at their pride. Darnell, always the more cunning of the two, decided that if Ethan had a secret, it was worth exposing, if only to humiliate him further and reclaim the laughter that had slipped away. One Friday afternoon, as Ethan finished his short shift at Brew-Amp, Bean Cafe, balancing trays of coffee mugs and greeting regulars with polite warmth, he didn't notice his brother across the street, leaning against a car with his phone raised. The shutter clicked silently, capturing Ethan in his apron, wiping down tables, carrying bags of beans from the back. Later that evening, Darnell uploaded the photos with captions meant to cut deep. "Look at our brother, corporate legend in the making barista of the month," he wrote, accompanied by laughing emojis and hashtags that twisted the knife further. Within hours, mutual friends and even some distant relatives had seen the post, some adding their own comments, others shaking their heads at the cruelty. By Saturday morning, Ethan's phone buzzed with messages, some sympathetic, some mocking, all reminding him of the fragile line he walked between dignity and shame. He closed his eyes, breathing through the storm. He wanted to be angry, wanted to confront Darnell, but he knew that reacting in rage would only fuel their mockery. Instead, he told himself the truth. The cafe was not a symbol of failure, but of survival. It was the bridge he walked while building something greater. And more importantly, it was the very place where his real education was happening. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening after the cafe closed and the last chair was stacked on the tables, Ethan would sit in the corner booth across from Leonard Parker, a retired black financial advisor who had built and sold multiple firms before stepping away from the business world. Mr. Parker was sharp-eyed and silver-haired, his voice gravelly but steady, and he had become both mentor and anchor for Ethan. "Don't flinch when they laugh," Parker told him one night as they sipped black coffee in chipped mugs. "Mockery is just proof that they're watching. And if they're watching, they're already afraid of what you might become." Those words etched themselves into Ethan's memory, a shield against the noise. While Carla and Darnell bragged about promotions and posted photos of downtown offices, Ethan was learning how money moved, how contracts worked, how businesses grew and failed. Parker showed him balance sheets, taught him the power of equity, explained the traps of debt. He spoke bluntly, with no sugarcoating, challenging Ethan to think bigger than wages and titles. "Jobs come and go," Parker said. "Ownership is what lasts. Don't chase a paycheck, son. Build something that pays you even when you're asleep." Ethan scribbled notes into a worn notebook, absorbing every lesson, every warning, every principle. Each meeting was another brick in the foundation he was quietly constructing, a foundation his siblings couldn't see. So when Darnell's photos made their rounds, Ethan didn't respond. He let them think what they wanted, let them enjoy their shallow victory. Outwardly, he was the brother in an apron, the punchline in a coffee shop. Inwardly, he was the student of a man who had walked paths his siblings didn't even know existed. At the next family gathering, Carla wasted no time bringing up the photos. "So, Ethan," she said with a smirk, "how's the cafe life treating you? Do you get free lattes with that paycheck?" The room chuckled, waiting for Ethan to wilt, but he simply smiled faintly and replied, "It pays the bills." His calm disarmed them, the lack of defensiveness leaving them unsatisfied. Carla frowned, pressing harder. "You see, Mama, this is what I mean. We're out here building careers, and Ethan is serving coffee. Don't you think it's time he grew up?" Their mother's lips tightened, caught between pride in her successful children and worry for her youngest. Ethan watched her, the ache in his chest deepening, but he reminded himself of Parker's words, "Don't flinch." He didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded politely, excused himself, and stepped outside for air. Under the dim glow of the porch light, he pulled out his phone and reread Parker's latest text. "Remember, silence is strength when the truth is still loading. Let them talk. One day you'll walk into the room and their laughter will choke in their throats." Ethan tucked the phone away, the sting of mockery already fading. He knew that Parker was right. The cafe wasn't the end of his story, it was the training ground. And while his siblings wasted energy tearing him down, he was learning how to rise. Weeks later, he met Parker again at the cafe, the old man spreading out financial statements across the table. "You've got an eye for this," Parker said, tapping a sheet with his finger. "You see what others miss. That's rare. I've seen people with degrees and titles who can't read a balance sheet half as well as you just did." Ethan flushed with pride, the validation warming him from the inside out. "But remember," Parker added, "this knowledge isn't just for survival, it's for building. One day, you'll have to step into ownership, and when you do, you'll need every lesson I've taught you." Ethan nodded, determination hardening inside him. Let Carla and Darnell laugh. Let them post photos. He would endure the humiliation because he knew what they didn't. He was preparing for a day when the tables would turn, and when that day came, their cruel exposure would mean nothing compared to the truth he carried in silence. Ethan thought he had grown numb to humiliation, but his mother's words pierced him in a way Carla's and Darnell's laughter never could. It happened late one evening when the house was quiet, the television flickering in the background as his mother folded laundry at the dining table. He sat across from her, sipping water when she sighed and said, "Ethan, baby, I don't know how much longer you can keep drifting like this. Look at your brother and sister, they're moving forward, climbing ladders, making me proud. And you're still stuck." The words dropped heavy between them, heavier than the baskets of clothes she stacked with care. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her about the startup, about the nights at the cafe with Mr. Parker, about the notebooks filled with strategies and lessons, but the fear of her disbelief held him back. He pictured her shaking her head, dismissing his efforts as another dead end, and the thought was unbearable. So he stayed silent, nodding slowly, carrying the wound like a secret bruise. That night, he lay awake in his bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering if he was deluding himself. His siblings had prestige, salaries, benefits, and recognition. All he had were late-night conversations over black coffee and stacks of papers filled with numbers. Doubt gnawed at him, whispering that maybe Carla and Darnell were right, maybe his mother was right, maybe he was wasting his life. But the next day, as he sat with Parker in the cafe, the old man leaned forward and said, "Don't measure yourself by their timeline, son. They're climbing ladders someone else built." You're laying bricks. Ladders can break. Bricks last. Ethan clung to those words like a lifeline. Months passed. Ethan worked his shifts at the cafe, met Parker twice a week, and absorbed lessons like a sponge. He learned about capital, about how investors thought, about risk versus reward. He studied case files of businesses that thrived and those that failed, dissecting every decision until he could see patterns others missed. He practiced presenting ideas, sometimes stumbling, sometimes finding his rhythm, Parker correcting him with firm but encouraging guidance. Outside of those nights, Carla and Darnell continued their crusade of mockery. They sent him job postings with sarcastic notes like, "Perfect for you assistant dishwasher." They bragged about new company perks, flashing photos of office parties, expensive dinners, and company retreats. And each time Ethan saw those images, the ache in his chest deepened, but so did his resolve. Then one evening, as rain pattered softly against the cafe windows, Parker slid a folder across the table. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone unusually serious. Ethan opened the folder and found documents he didn't immediately understand: shareholder agreements, equity certificates, transfer clauses. He looked up, confused. Parker's eyes held steady. "I'm not going to be around forever. I've built enough and I've stepped away from the front lines. But I've still got a stake in the company, a big one. And I've been watching you. You've got grit. You've got vision. You remind me of myself when I was younger, before the money, before the titles, hungry, focused." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Mr. Parker, I don't." "Don't say you don't deserve it," Parker cut in, his voice sharp. "I've seen what you endure. Most men would have crumbled by now. You took their laughter and turned it into fuel. That's what a leader does. That's what an owner does. I want you to take my shares. I'll sell them to you for a symbolic amount because this isn't about money for me anymore, it's about legacy. And I'd rather leave it with someone who understands struggle than with some smooth talker in a suit." Ethan's hands trembled as he flipped through the documents, the weight of what Parker was offering settling over him like a tidal wave. Ownership, real ownership. The very thing Parker had preached about in every lesson. He wasn't just teaching Ethan theory, he was handing him the keys. "Why me?" Ethan asked quietly. Parker leaned back, his eyes softening. "Because you know what it's like to be counted out. Because you know the value of silence and the power of patience, and because you won't waste it. I've watched your brother and sister, they look the part, but they don't have the heart. You do." For the first time in years, Ethan felt tears prick his eyes. Not from humiliation, not from anger, but from the sudden rush of validation, of possibility, of hope. He nodded slowly, his voice breaking. "I won't let you down," Parker smiled, lifting his cup in a small toast. "I know you won't. Now let's get to work." Over the next few weeks, Ethan poured himself into preparation. He studied the agreements until he could recite clauses by heart. He asked questions relentlessly, sometimes until midnight, Parker answering each one with the patience of a man who had waited his whole life to pass on wisdom. Ethan learned not just how to own, but how to lead, how to spot opportunities, how to shield himself from traps. He felt himself growing, not in the shallow way his siblings measured growth, but in the deep, steady way that built unshakable foundations. Meanwhile, his mother noticed subtle changes. Ethan seemed steadier, more focused, his eyes carrying a quiet confidence she hadn't seen before. She asked once more if he had considered applying for corporate jobs, and this time he simply smiled and said, "I've got something else in motion." She shook her head, unconvinced, but deep down she sensed a shift she couldn't explain. Carla and Darnell, however, remained blind. They continued their mockery, more vicious now, as if sensing that their grip on him was slipping. They teased him at gatherings, reminded him loudly that he was still the one without a title, the one without a paycheck that mattered. But Ethan no longer carried their words as chains. He carried Parker's offer, Parker's belief, Parker's legacy waiting to be claimed. And with every insult, he felt the gap between what they thought of him and what he knew to be true grow wider, until one day soon, it would break open completely. The months rolled on and Ethan felt his world begin to change, even though on the surface it looked the same to everyone else. He still worked the part-time shifts at the cafe, still returned home to his mother's modest house, still drove the same aging car that rattled on the freeway, but beneath the surface, Something profound was happening. He carried Parker's trust like armor, studying every clause and every line of the shareholder agreements, learning how to protect what was being handed to him. Each meeting with Parker became less about theory and more about strategy, about practical steps for what it meant to own a controlling stake in a company. Ethan moved quietly, not telling a soul, not even his mother, because the lesson Parker drilled into him again and again was simple. Real power moves in silence until the right moment to strike. Meanwhile, Carla and Darnell continued their climb in the corporate firm, their arrogance swelling with each new title. At the next family dinner, they arrived with the same polished presence they always flaunted, but now with even more pomp. Carla wasted no time announcing that she had been officially promoted to management, her eyes sparkling with triumph as she added, "It's about time they recognize my potential. Now I finally get to oversee my own team, and this is only the beginning." Darnell chimed in almost immediately, unwilling to let his sister outshine him, boasting that he too had stepped into a managerial role, handling larger accounts and supervising a group of analysts. "We're finally where we're supposed to be," he declared proudly, raising his glass in a mock toast. "And some of us will always stay where they are at the bottom, looking up." His eyes darted deliberately to Ethan, the words landing heavy like stones. Carla smirked, her voice dripping with the same venom Ethan had grown used to. "That's right. Some of us were built for leadership and some of us were built to serve. Ethan, you should be proud of us. At least someone in this family is making a name worth remembering." The table laughed uncomfortably, his mother shifting in her chair but saying nothing, the weight of her silence once again pressing against Ethan's chest. He felt the familiar sting, but this time it did not cut as deeply as before. He had Parker's voice in his head reminding him of the truth, reminding him that ladders can break, but bricks last. They thought they had reached the peak of their journey, but they had no idea they were standing on ground he now owned. Because just 3 days earlier, in a quiet office with a notary present, Ethan had signed the paperwork that made him the majority shareholder of the very firm Carla and Darnell now worshipped. Parker had sat across from him, his eyes filled with pride as Ethan's pen scratched across the pages. "This is it," Parker said firmly. "From this day forward, you are no longer just a student. You are an owner. Remember that ownership means responsibility. It means you carry not just the weight of your own life, but the lives of the people who work under this company. Carry it with dignity." Ethan nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of fear and pride. He could barely process the enormity of what had just happened. For years, he had been the brother without a job, the one mocked for sweeping floors and making lattes, but now, without his siblings even realizing it, he had become their superior in ways they could not yet comprehend. He drove home that day with the signed documents locked in a folder on the passenger seat, staring at them at every red light, his heart racing with disbelief. He had promised Parker he would not squander the opportunity, that he would use it to build rather than boast, and that meant continuing to play his role in silence until the moment was right. So, at the dinner table, as Carla and Darnell raised their glasses to themselves, Ethan simply smiled faintly and let their arrogance echo. They thought they were soaring above him, but in truth, every step they took up the ladder was on rungs he now controlled. He chewed his food slowly, forcing himself not to reveal the triumph bubbling inside because he understood the power of timing. If he revealed too soon, they would twist it, dismiss it, or worse, try to undermine it before the ink on the contracts was even dry. Better to let them bask in their shallow pride. Better to let them mock him one more time, because soon the laughter would die on their lips. Later that night, when the dishes were cleared and his siblings left still gloating about their new responsibilities, Ethan retreated to his room and unlocked the drawer where he kept Parker's folder. He pulled out the documents again, tracing his name on the lines where he had signed, whispering to himself that this was real. For so long he had been invisible, the target of humiliation, the disappointment of his family, but now he was the one with the power to change everything. He thought of his mother's tired face, her pride reserved for Carla and Darnell, and he imagined the day when she would finally look at him with the same pride, not because he demanded it, but because the truth could not be denied. He thought of the cousins who had laughed at parties, the uncles who had nodded along with Carla's cutting jokes, and he imagined their silence when they discovered the truth. And he thought of his siblings, so certain of their superiority, so blind to the reality that the very company they flaunted as their badge of honor now belonged to him. Ethan closed the folder, locked it away again, and sat in the quiet darkness of his room. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, his heart calm. He had learned from Parker that leadership was not about proving people wrong in a single moment of defiance, but about showing up day after day, brick by brick, until the structure stood undeniable. That was what he was doing now. Carla and Darnell might believe they had reached their peak, but Ethan knew the truth. Their pride was only a prelude to their downfall, and their downfall would come not through revenge or spite, but through the simple unveiling of reality. The days following his siblings' smug celebration of their promotions were some of the hardest Ethan had endured, not because their words cut him the way they once did, but because it took every ounce of discipline to hold his tongue while the truth burned in his chest. He carried the signed shareholder documents everywhere he went, tucked in a leather folder that never left his sight, a constant reminder that the tables had already turned even if no one else knew it yet. He went to work at the cafe, met Parker twice a week, and returned home each night to his mother's weary face, still unaware that her youngest son was no longer the disappointment of the family, but the man who owned the company her other children boasted about. Parker had warned him repeatedly, "Patience, Ethan. Let the right moment reveal itself. If you move too early, you weaken the power of the truth. Timing is everything in business and in life." Ethan listened. He waited. And then one afternoon, as he sifted through a stack of mail on the kitchen counter, an envelope caught his eye. The paper was heavier, the ink embossed with the logo he had memorized from the shareholder agreements. His fingers trembled as he slid the letter opener through the flap and unfolded the contents. Inside was an invitation, written in elegant script, announcing the annual corporate gala where the firm would reveal new leadership changes and honor those who had made significant contributions to the company's growth. Ethan's breath caught. This was it, the moment Parker had prepared him for. The stage where the truth would no longer be a secret held in silence, but a revelation impossible to ignore. He read the invitation twice, then a third time, his heart racing faster with each pass. The gala was not merely a social event, it was the event. The one night of the year when every executive, every manager, every ambitious employee, and every potential investor gathered in one glittering ballroom to see the future of the firm unfold. And this year, the future was Ethan. He could already imagine the shock on Carla and Darnell's faces when his name was spoken, when he walked onto the stage not as the failure they had mocked, but as the owner of the very company they worshipped. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to smile without restraint. That evening, he sat with Parker in their usual booth at the cafe and slid the invitation across the table. Parker studied it silently, then looked up, his eyes gleaming with pride. "This is it," he said firmly. "This is where silence ends and truth begins. You've played your role well, you've let them underestimate you, and now you'll walk into that room and the weight of reality will crush every lie they've told about you. But remember, Ethan, this isn't about revenge. This is about stepping into your place. Walk with dignity. Let your presence speak louder than your anger ever could." Ethan nodded, repeating Parker's words in his mind until they became his mantra. The following week, his siblings texted him out of the blue, a group message buzzing on his phone as he left the cafe late one night. Carla's message read, "Guess who's going to the corporate gala? Oh wait, not you. Only real employees get invited." Darnell followed quickly with his own jab. "If you want, Ethan, maybe we can get you in to polish the shoes at the door. At least then you'll be useful." Ethan stared at the screen, his lips pressing into a tight line. A few months ago, those words would have gutted him, sent him spiraling into shame and silence, but now they only fueled the fire inside, not with pain, but with anticipation. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Soon enough they would see, and their words would dissolve in their throats like ash. Over the next few days, Ethan prepared carefully. He visited a tailor for the first time in his life, stepping into a charcoal suit that fit his frame perfectly, the fabric hugging his shoulders with a confidence he hadn't felt before. He bought polished shoes that gleamed under the lights, a tie that added just enough color without stealing attention, and cufflinks Parker gifted him from his own collection. "You don't just walk into power," Parker told him as he adjusted the cufflinks on Ethan's wrists. "You embody it. You let them feel it the moment you step into the room." Ethan practiced his posture in the mirror, practiced the steady gaze that would silence whispers, practiced the calm smile that would communicate strength without arrogance. He thought of his mother, of the years she had carried disappointment in her eyes, and he imagined the pride that would replace it when she learned the truth. He thought of the nights of mockery, the cruel jokes, the photos posted online, and he felt the burn of vindication, not as revenge, but as proof that survival was never weakness. The day of the gala arrived with the crisp chill of autumn in the air. Ethan stood before his mirror one last time, adjusting his tie, his reflection no longer the man his siblings mocked, but the man Parker had seen all along, the man ready to own his place. His phone buzzed again, another message from Carla. "Don't embarrass yourself tonight, Ethan. People like you don't belong in places like that." Ethan slipped the phone into his pocket without responding, his resolve unshaken. As he drove to the hotel where the gala was held, the city lights reflected off his windshield, each flicker reminding him of how far he had come. He pulled into the valet line, stepped out of his car, and handed over the keys with steady hands. The doorman nodded respectfully, unaware that the young man before him owned a piece of the building's future. Inside the lobby, the air hummed with the sound of conversation and laughter, the scent of expensive cologne and perfume mingling under the crystal chandeliers. Carla and Darnell were already there, mingling with other managers, their confidence radiating as they spoke loudly about their recent promotions. They hadn't noticed Ethan yet, and for a brief moment, he stood at the edge of the room watching them, letting the scene etch itself into his memory. They were so certain, so sure of their superiority, so blind to the truth, standing just a few feet away. Ethan drew a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward. Every stride carried him closer to the moment Parker had promised, the moment when silence would end and truth would speak for itself. The stage was set and Ethan was ready. The ballroom shimmered with light as chandeliers sparkled overhead and a sea of well-dressed guests filled the grand hall, their conversations blending into a hum of power and ambition. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, balancing trays of champagne flutes, while a jazz band played softly in the corner, setting a tone of elegance that matched the occasion. Ethan stood near the back, his heart pounding but his posture steady, his tailored suit hugging his frame with a confidence he had only recently begun to feel. Every step, every breath reminded him of the months of silence, of humiliation endured, of lessons absorbed at the cafe with Parker. Tonight, all of that would come together in one undeniable truth, and he knew once he stepped onto the stage, there would be no turning back. Carla and Darnell were across the room, surrounded by colleagues who laughed at their stories and clinked glasses in admiration. Carla's emerald dress shimmered under the lights, her laughter cutting through the hum like glass, while Darnell adjusted his tie and gestured broadly, basking in the spotlight of his recent promotion. They hadn't noticed Ethan yet, and he allowed himself a small smile as he watched them revel, so secure in their place, so convinced of their superiority. He thought of their text messages, mocking him about polishing shoes, and the irony settled in his chest like a secret too delicious to rush. Soon enough, their laughter would fade, replaced by silence heavy enough to choke. The evening unfolded with speeches from department heads and acknowledgments of milestones reached, applause rippling through the room with each name called. Ethan's palms grew damp, his nerves buzzing, but Parker's voice echoed in his mind. Walk with dignity. Don't rush. Let the truth land on its own weight. Finally, the interim CEO, a tall man with silver hair and a commanding voice, stepped up to the podium. The band quieted, the chatter hushed, and all eyes turned to the stage. The CEO cleared his throat and smiled warmly. Tonight we celebrate not only the successes of the past year, but also the beginning of a new chapter in our company's history. As many of you know, recent changes in ownership have positioned us for growth unlike anything we've seen before. And with that comes new leadership, fresh vision, and the promise of even greater achievements. Carla leaned forward in her chair, her eyes gleaming, certain the moment was about to affirm her importance. Darnell smirked, straightening his posture, ready to bask in recognition by association. Ethan's pulse quickened as the CEO's words continued. It is my honor to introduce to you the individual who now holds the controlling stake in our company, someone whose journey represents resilience, vision, and an unshakable belief in the power of persistence. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Ethan Williams. For a heartbeat, silence blanketed the room. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap, impossible to comprehend. Then gasps erupted, whispers rushing like a wave, heads turning sharply in search of the man they had long dismissed. Ethan drew a slow breath, straightened his tie, and began walking down the aisle toward the stage. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step a declaration, each stride undoing years of ridicule. Carla's jaw dropped, her glass slipping slightly in her hand as her eyes widened in disbelief. Darnell froze, his smirk evaporating, his face pale as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Their eyes followed him, confusion and shock battling for dominance as the brother they had mocked, belittled, and dismissed rose before them in a role they had never imagined. The whispers grew louder. Did he say Ethan Williams? Isn't that their brother? I thought he was jobless? Phones were lifted, photos snapped, the moment immortalized in pixels as Ethan mounted the steps and approached the podium. The CEO shook his hand firmly, leaning in to say quietly, "They didn't see this coming. That's the power of silence." Ethan nodded, then turned to face the crowd. The lights were blinding, but the sight of Carla and Darnell in the audience, stunned and motionless, grounded him. He adjusted the microphone, his voice calm but firm. "Good evening. I know some of you may be surprised to see me standing here tonight. For years, people have defined me by what they thought I wasn't, jobless, aimless, lost. But tonight I stand here not because of what they said, but because of what I refuse to give up on. I stand here because every moment of doubt, every word of mockery, every closed door taught me resilience. And resilience is the foundation of leadership." The room erupted in applause, though Ethan's eyes remained fixed on his siblings. Carla shifted uncomfortably, forcing a brittle smile as whispers surrounded her. Darnell rubbed his jaw, his pride fractured in plain view. Ethan allowed himself a brief pause, letting the weight of the moment sink in before continuing. "This company is not just a business, it's a vision of what can be achieved when hard work meets opportunity. I plan to honor the legacy of those who came before me, particularly Mr. Leonard Parker, who believed in me when others did not. Together, we will build something greater than profits. We will build a legacy of integrity and opportunity." More applause filled the room, the sound thunderous, undeniable. Ethan stepped back from the microphone, his chest steady, his heart no longer weighed down by the chains of humiliation. He had arrived not as a victim, but as a leader. As he left the podium and returned to his seat at the head table, the whispers continued, phones buzzing, the narrative of his life rewritten in real time. Carla and Darnell sat in stunned silence, the faces of managers and colleagues around them shifting with curiosity and even pity. They had mocked him relentlessly, but now they had to confront the truth. The brother they had tried to bury had become the man they now answered to. Ethan lifted his glass, his gaze meeting theirs across the room, and for the first time in years, he smiled openly, no longer hiding, no longer diminished. The reveal was complete and the power of silence had done its work. The gala continued long after Ethan's speech. The band playing upbeat jazz as guests mingled, congratulated him, and speculated about what his leadership would mean for the company's future. Ethan accepted each handshake with quiet humility, thanking people for their support while keeping his gaze steady and his words measured. He did not boast, he did not gloat, he did not even look directly at his siblings again until much later in the evening when the crowd began to thin and the energy of the night slowed to a quieter rhythm. Carla and Darnell had sat stiffly at their table for most of the evening, their forced smiles fooling no one, their drinks untouched as whispers swirled around them. Every time another guest approached Ethan to congratulate him, every time someone snapped a photo of him with an investor, every time Parker's name was mentioned as his mentor, their jaws tightened and their bodies stiffened. They had spent years defining Ethan as the family's failure, and now that illusion had collapsed in a single night. When the band packed up and the chandeliers dimmed slightly, Carla finally stood, her heels clicking against the polished floor with sharp purpose. Darnell followed close behind, his jaw clenched, his eyes hard. They crossed the room and intercepted Ethan near the exit, cornering him against a marble pillar with expressions that mixed rage, disbelief, and desperation. "You need to explain yourself," Carla hissed, her voice low but fierce. "What the hell was that? Some kind of stunt? You controlling owner? That doesn't make sense." Darnell leaned in closer, his voice harsher. Yeah, man, cut the crap. You? The guy we caught making lattes? You expect us to believe you suddenly own the company? What did you do? Trick Parker into signing something? Blackmail him? This isn't you, Ethan. You don't belong in this world. Ethan straightened his shoulders, his eyes calm, his voice even. I don't need to trick anyone. I earned this. Parker saw something in me you never bothered to see. And tonight wasn't a stunt, it was the truth. Carla scoffed, shaking her head, her earrings swinging with the force of her indignation. Truth? Don't play righteous with me. You've been nothing for years. Mama cried herself to sleep worrying about you. We carried this family's pride while you embarrassed us, and now you want us to believe you just flipped the script? Ethan reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out the leather folder he had guarded for months. Slowly, deliberately, he opened it and held out the documents for them to see. These are the signed agreements. I didn't trick anyone. I didn't steal anything. Parker transferred his shares to me because he believed I had the grit to build what comes next. I'm the majority shareholder. That's not luck. That's not manipulation. That's preparation. Darnell snatched one of the documents from Ethan's hand, scanning it quickly, his face paling as the legal language confirmed every word. Carla leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting across the lines, her breath quickening as the reality sank in. This can't be real, she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time that evening. You can't be above us. You just can't. Ethan tucked the folder back into his jacket, his movements steady, his composure unshaken. For years you told me I was beneath you. You laughed, you mocked, you crushed me with words sharper than knives. And all that time, you never saw me, you never believed in me. Parker did. And because of that, I stand here tonight as your superior. Darnell's face flushed crimson, his fists clenching at his sides. You think this makes you better than us? You think sitting on some shares changes who you are? Ethan's gaze locked on his brother's, steady and unflinching. It doesn't make me better, it makes me different. I don't measure worth by job titles or mockery, I measure it by resilience. I measure it by how many times I've been knocked down and still stood back up. That's what Parker saw, that's why I'm here. That's why you'll now report to me. A few colleagues lingering nearby had begun to notice the confrontation, their eyes widening as they caught pieces of the exchange. Whispers rose again, murmurs threading through the air as the scene unfolded in plain view. Carla, realizing the eyes upon her, tried to salvage her dignity, forcing a brittle laugh that rang hollow. Well, isn't this just cute? Ethan, the golden boy? Who would have thought? But her voice trembled, betraying the cracks beneath her facade. Darnell, unable to maintain composure, shoved the document back into Ethan's chest, his voice low and venomous. This isn't over. You don't deserve this. Ethan slipped the folder back into his jacket, his calm unbroken. Whether I deserve it or not isn't your decision. It's already done. And from here on, the only thing that matters is how we move forward. You can keep clinging to your pride, or you can accept the truth and do your jobs under my leadership. That choice is yours. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the sound of a waiter collecting empty glasses nearby. Carla and Darnell stared at him, their faces pale with the weight of humiliation, their confidence shattered in front of the very colleagues who had once admired their arrogance. Ethan did not gloat, did not raise his voice, did not rub the truth in their faces with cruelty. He simply stood tall, the embodiment of Parker's lesson, let the truth land on its own weight. And it had landed, crushing every lie they had spoken, every insult they had hurled, every false narrative they had built around him. As the siblings turned away, retreating quickly toward the exit with their dignity in tatters, Ethan felt Parker's hand on his shoulder. The old man had been watching from across the room, his eyes gleaming with quiet pride. You handled that well, Parker murmured. You didn't need to shout. You didn't need revenge. You let the truth speak for itself. That's leadership. Ethan nodded slowly, his chest swelling with both relief and resolve. The reckoning had come not in the form of vengeance, but in the form of revelation, and it had left his siblings speechless. The boy they had mocked had become the man they could not deny. The week after the gala, whispers spread across the company like wildfire. Ethan's reveal had left managers, employees, and even long-standing executives in shock, scrambling to understand how the brother they had been told was jobless had suddenly become their superior. Carla and Darnell could barely face their colleagues without hearing murmurs of disbelief, and each look that lingered on them carried unspoken questions about what they had said of Ethan for years compared to what was now undeniably true. Their pride had been stripped bare in public, and though they tried to mask their humiliation with brittle smiles and overcompensating confidence, they could feel the shift in the air. Respect was no longer theirs by default, and whispers followed them wherever they went. Ethan, meanwhile, moved deliberately, not rushing to assert his power with reckless displays, but instead walking each step with Parker's lessons etched firmly in his mind. "Let your actions speak louder than your pride," Parker had told him. "Revenge burns fast and leaves you empty. Justice, patience, and leadership, they build legacies." So Ethan spent the following days in meetings with senior partners, learning the rhythms of leadership from the inside, understanding what decisions would shape not only the company's future, but also the lives of the employees who depended on it. Every choice mattered, and Ethan knew he could not afford to stumble into arrogance the way his siblings had. By the end of the week, the boardroom was filled with tension as an emergency leadership session was called. The long mahogany table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, leather chairs lined neatly along its length, and folders thick with financial reports were spread out before the executives. Ethan sat at the head of the table, calm and collected, his tailored suit once again fitting him like armor. To his left and right sat men and women decades older than him, eyes watchful, waiting to see how he would carry himself now that the shock had worn off. And across from him, sitting uncomfortably with stiff posture, were Carla and Darnell, their usual confidence drained, their smirks nowhere to be found. They looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of their arrogance had collapsed in on itself, leaving them with nothing but the reality of who they truly were without the illusion of superiority. The meeting began with routine discussions about quarterly numbers, restructuring strategies, and pending contracts, but the unspoken tension filled every pause, every shift in tone. Finally, one of the senior executives turned to Ethan and asked directly, "Mr. Williams, as controlling shareholder, what is your vision for leadership moving forward, particularly concerning your siblings who are in management roles? Some here question whether their futures align with the company under your direction." The air grew still. Carla and Darnell stiffened, their eyes darting to Ethan, desperation flickering beneath their carefully guarded expressions. They knew this was the moment he could strip everything from them, the moment he could return every insult, every humiliation, every cruel word with a single decision that would end their careers. For a long moment, Ethan sat silent, his hands folded on the table, his eyes fixed on the documents before him. Then he lifted his gaze and met their eyes, steady and calm. "Carla, Darnell, for years you mocked me. You called me worthless, jobless, a burden. You measured my life against titles and paychecks and mocked me for not keeping up. And you never once stopped to ask what I was building quietly in silence. Tonight, I could end your positions here. I could make you taste the failure you tried to feed me, but I won't." The room shifted, murmurs rippling as Carla's eyes widened, Darnell's jaw tightening as though he couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. Ethan continued, his voice stronger now, carrying the weight of both pain and purpose. "Because leadership isn't about revenge. Leadership is about vision. It's about lifting even those who try to drag you down. I will not fire you. I will not strip you of your positions. Instead, I will hold you accountable. You will work, and you will work hard. And for the first time in your careers, you will know what it means to answer not to your pride, but to a standard of integrity. If you meet it, you will thrive. If you fail, you will reveal yourselves and the company will move forward without you." Silence blanketed the room, heavy and undeniable. Carla's lips parted, but no words came. Darnell swallowed hard, his face flushed, his eyes falling to the table. For the first time, they were speechless, not from shock alone, but from the sudden realization that Ethan was not the man they thought they could control or diminish. He was something more, something larger, and they were left with the choice to rise with him or fall under the weight of their own arrogance. Parker, seated quietly in the corner as an honored guest, smiled faintly, his eyes glimmering with pride. He had always told Ethan the truth, that revenge burns quickly, but vision endures, and tonight Ethan had proven that lesson true. The executives nodded slowly, respect building in their eyes, not just because Ethan held the title, but because he carried it with dignity, with the restraint and resilience of a true leader. The meeting concluded, the boardroom emptying until only Ethan remained. He sat in silence for a long moment, the echoes of the evening swirling in his mind. He thought of the dinners where he had been mocked, the birthdays where he had been humiliated, the nights when his mother had compared him to his siblings and found him lacking. He thought of the cafe, the long hours, the notebooks filled with Parker's lessons, and then he thought of this moment, sitting at the head of the table, not with arrogance, but with peace. Later that night, as he returned home, his mother was waiting in the kitchen, her hands folded, her eyes filled with questions she had been too afraid to ask. Ethan walked to her, placed the documents gently on the table, and said softly, "Mama, I made it." Tears welled in her eyes as she reached for his hand, her voice breaking. "I always prayed you would, I just didn't see it." Ethan smiled, kissing her forehead. "You don't have to see it, Mama, you just have to believe it." And for the first time in years, she looked at him not with worry, but with pride. The boy she had once feared would never find his way had become the man who redefined what success meant, not only for himself, but for everyone watching. The story of Ethan Williams, the brother mocked for being jobless, had ended not with revenge, but with redemption. His siblings, humbled and forced to see him clearly, now worked under his leadership. His mother, once filled with disappointment, now carried pride. And Ethan himself carried the message Parker had given him all along, that resilience, patience, and vision outlast every insult, every humiliation, every doubt. The end was not the humiliation of others, but the revelation of truth. Ethan had not just proven them wrong, he had proven himself right. The end. If you stayed through Ethan's journey, I want to thank you. Stories like his remind us that resilience and patience can outlast cruelty and arrogance, and that true leadership isn't built on revenge, but on vision and dignity. If this story spoke to you, hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. I'd love to hear from you too. What part of Ethan's story struck you the hardest? Was it the moment he stepped on stage at the gala, or when he chose integrity over revenge in the boardroom? And tell me where you're watching from. It's always powerful to see how far these stories reach. Your comments and support help keep these stories alive.